The Middle Passage was one leg of the triangular trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas as part of the Atlantic slave trade. You've heard me refer to the Atlantic slave trade as abysmal, in that the depths of the brutality Africans experienced can never be fully captured. As Toni Morrison has cautioned, to do so is impossible. Language can never pin down slavery, genocide, war, nor should it yearn for the arrogance to be able to do so. Olaudah Equiano, however, does offer us just a glimpse of one person's ordeal. Equiano's book, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vasa the African, provides a rare first-hand account of the Middle Passage from someone who actually experienced it. A warning to viewers, this excerpt contains graphic scenes that may be disturbing to some viewers. His narrative begins on the continent of Africa, through the Middle Passage, and continues by chronicling his experience in the Western Hemisphere, and finally his emancipation. As he's being brought on board the slave ship that is to take him to the Western Hemisphere, he writes, "Soon after this, the blacks who brought me on board went off, and left me abandoned to despair. I now saw myself deprived of all chance of returning to my native country, or even the least glimpse of hope of gaining the shore, which I now considered as friendly. And I even wished for my former slavery, in preference to my present situation." That's a very profound statement that he makes here, because, as we've seen, slavery is nothing new in terms of human history. The Egyptians practiced it, the Romans practiced it, the Greeks practiced it, West Africans practiced it. But what he makes clear here is there's a very sharp distinction between slavery as it existed in West Africa and what he was experiencing, a watershed moment in terms of human history. He continues, "I was soon put down under the decks, and there I received such a salutation in my nostrils as I had never experienced in my life. So that, with the loathsomeness of the stench and the crying together, I became so sick and low that I was not able to eat, nor had I the least desire to taste anything. I now wished for the last friend, death, to relieve me, but soon to my grief 2 of the white men offered me eatables, and on my refusing to eat, one of them held me fast by the hands and laid me across, I think, the windlass, and tied my feet, while the other flogged me severely. I had never experienced anything of this kind before, and although not being used to the water, I naturally feared that element for the first time that I saw it. Yet nevertheless, could I have got over the nettings, I would have jumped over the side, but I could not. And besides, the crew used to watch us very closely, who were not chained down to the decks, lest we should leap into the water. I've seen some of these poor African prisoners most severely cut for attempting to do so, and hourly whipped for not eating. One day, when we had smooth sea and moderate wind, 2 of my wearied countrymen who were chained together, I was near them at the time, preferring death to such a life of misery, somehow made through the nettings and jumped into the sea. Immediately, another quite dejected fellow, who on account of his illness was suffered to be out of his irons, they took him out of his irons because he was sick, also followed their example, and I believe many more would have done the same, had they not been prevented by the ship's crew, who were instantly alarmed. Later, he writes of the justification of slavery, the Western justification of slavery as a rescue from barbarism. He answers that assertion by writing later on, "O ye nominal Christians, might not an African ask you? Learn this from your God, who says unto you, do unto all men as you should have them do unto you. Is it not enough that we're torn from our country and friends to toil for your luxury of lust and gain? Must every tender feeling be likewise sacrificed to your avarice? Are the dearest friends and relations now rendered more dear by their separation from their kindred, still to be parted from each other, and thus prevented from cheering the gloom of slavery with the small comfort of being together, and mingling their sufferings and sorrows? Why are parents to lose their children, brothers their sisters, or husbands their wives? Surely this is a new refinement in cruelty, which, while it has no advantage to atone for it, thus aggravates distress and adds fresh horrors, even to the wretchedness of slavery." Equiano's narrative reveals several things about the institution of slavery on a global context. 1. Slavery was never anything new. West Africa was no exception. If you recall our earlier discussion of the frontier, West Africa was full of meeting places between 2 or more groups of people who considered themselves distinct from one another. As is often the case when two or more groups of people meet, there was conflict. With conflict comes warfare. With warfare comes war captives. And what do civilizations tend to do with their enemies they've captured during warfare? They, of course, enslave them. That is the reason why the institution of slavery is about as old as human civilization itself. Slavery had existed prior to the arrival of Europeans and continued from the very beginnings of West African civilizations of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, and continued when Muslims arrived on the scene. By the time Europeans arrived on the scene, the institution of slavery and the slave trade was already well established and well entrenched. There was simply no reason why Africans would have thought the trading of slaves to Europeans was anything different from anything that they had been doing for centuries. Again, recall our discussion of the frontier and how it can illuminate the choices people make as active agents in the historical events unfolding around them. While we can look back and see the devastating impact of those choices, we can also see how the choices Africans made in selling enemy groups to European slave traders would have made perfect sense to them at the time. It must also be stated, however, that the Atlantic slave trade was a radical departure from slavery we've seen up in world history up to that point. Slavery, up to that point, has typically been a way of incorporating populations. It was a way of Egyptians to Egyptianize a population. It was a way for Romans to Romanize a population. It was a way for Muslims to conquer and Islamicize a population. Slavery existed in the Atlantic slave trade was radically different. For reasons that we see in episode 4, Slavery in Black and White, slavery in the era of the Atlantic slave trade developed specifically as a means of separating out a population. So slavery becomes intergenerational, black folks get tagged with slave status, and stay at slave status as a way of separating them out in the population. Very radically different from any type of slavery we'd seen up to that point. In addition to Equiano's narrative, we have evidence of the particular hardships that women faced on the Middle Passage. Often sequestered from their male brethren in separate compartments below deck, African women were easy sexual targets for European slave traders on the long transatlantic voyage. Seasoning was a disciplinary process intended to modify the behavior and attitude of slaves, make them more effective laborers, and acculturate them to the new life and work routine of the Americas. As part of this process, the slaves' new masters gave them new names, the language was literally beaten out of them as well as their native religion, which was often a vehicle for resistance and rebellion. That's the reason why, as we saw in episode 5, Africans adapted by modifying their religion, so that they can disguise it as a European mode of worship. Planters housed slaves undergoing seasoning with old Africans and Creoles, second-generation Africans who were born in the Americas, who were worth up to 3 times the value of unseasoned new Africans.